Xanth's reptilian knuckles slammed into Carl's jaw, shattering his visor and snapping his head around until the crack of splitting human vertebrae sounded clearly to the alien mob of bullies that circled around. "Too bad they let this Earth monkey into the Galactic Academy," Xanth hissed with a forked tongue through razor teeth. "He's so small and weak and stupid, he'll never survive here anyway." The human's body crumpled in a heap to the ground. Carl's lifeblood and spittle leaked through the hole in his busted helmet onto the red dirt of the alien world Zephyrus Prime. He gasped for oxygen to fill his punctured lungs in the toxic methane atmosphere. His vision swam. Yet a small grin split the human's bruised and bloody face. If only these dumb Xenos knew what was coming. 22-year-old Carl Henry had succeeded against all odds and genetics to become one of only 5 humans ever accepted to study at the prestigious multi-species university. On his first day, he had hoped to find welcome and friendship, eager to represent the human race and build bridges between worlds. But his hulking reptilian roommate Xanth and his cronies Zor and Kresh had other plans. From the first insults at orientation to destroying Carl's projects to this brutal beating, the bullies were determined to put the puny Terran primate in his place. Now, as Carl felt his eyes swelling shut and his labored breathing slowing, the aliens laughed and high-fived in celebration over his prone form. They thought this Earther had been put down for good. However, little did these Xeno scum realize that humans naturally evolved in one of the harshest, deadliest, most hostile planetary ecosystems in the entire Orion Arm. The terrifying planet Earth had forged mankind's ancestors into the ultimate survivors through billions of years of unrelenting Darwinian selection. And arrogant soft aliens who had never faced true adversity were no match for the boundless potential and implacable resolve engineered into humanity's genes through the unforgiving crucible of their Deathworld. Especially when bullying one of these humans caused him to tap into that primal ferocity. Carl's eyes snapped open and began to burn with berserk fury. The pain in his body vanished, replaced by cold, clinical determination. He slowly pushed himself upright with bulging, wiry arms. It was time to teach these aliens what a grave mistake they had made by pushing this human to the breaking point. His knuckles cracked as he balled his fists. Oh, they would learn. They would all learn the depths of their folly here today. The corners of Carl's mouth twisted upwards into a savage smile that promised retribution. Days turned to weeks as Carl nursed his wounds, physical and mental. The human threw himself into his coursework with a renewed fervor, finding an odd peace in the pages of his textbooks and the hum of the Academy's labs. Yet even as he excelled academically, Carl withdrew from the vibrant social life he had once been so eager to embrace. He ate meals alone, avoided common areas, and ventured out only for classes, spending the rest of his time sequestered in his dorm room. It was this change in behavior that caught the attention of Jack Morrison, a fellow human student and former Marine. At 24, Jack was a couple years older than Carl and had seen his fair share of action before coming to the academy to study advanced combat tactics. He recognized the signs of someone who was hurting, who had been beaten down one too many times. One evening, Jack caught Carl in the hallway outside their rooms. "Hey man, got a minute?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes filled with concern. "I've noticed you've been keeping to yourself a lot lately. Everything all right?" Carl hesitated, debating how much to reveal, but there was something about Jack's straightforward manner that made him want to open up. It's Xanth and his crew," he admitted, his voice low. "They've been giving me a hard time. More than a hard time, actually. They beat me up pretty bad a few weeks ago." Jack's jaw tightened, a flash of anger passing over his features before he got it under control. "Those bastards," he muttered. "Listen, Carl, you don't have to put up with that shit. I can teach you some moves, help you defend yourself. Or I can have a little chat with Xanth myself, let him know he needs to back off." But Carl was already shaking his head. No, I appreciate it, Jack, but that'll only make things worse. They'll just come back twice as hard. I can handle it. I have to handle it." Jack looked like he wanted to argue, but he ultimately respected Carl's wishes. All right, man, but if you change your mind, you know where to find me. Carl managed a grateful smile. Thanks, Jack, I mean it. But even as he tried to put the conversation out of his mind and focus on his studies, Carl couldn't shake the feeling that something even more sinister was brewing. And he was right. It happened one afternoon in the xenobiology lab. Carl was hunched over his workstation, so engrossed in analyzing a sample under the microscope that he almost didn't hear Xanth and his cronies come in. But their grating laughter pulled him out of his concentration, and he couldn't help but overhear as they clustered around a computer terminal on the other side of the lab. "They're going to be epic," Zor was saying, his voice filled with cruel anticipation. "Those pathetic non-Katarian species won't know what hit them." "The Galactic Unity Festival," Xanth spat, as if the very words were poison on his forked tongue. "What a joke. But it's the perfect target. They'll all be gathered in one place, letting their guard down in the name of fostering understanding and cooperation. Idiots. And our virus will teach them the true meaning of Katarian dominance," Kresh chimed in. "Once it's released, it will spread like wildfire, targeting only inferior species. In a matter of days, the galaxy will be ours for the taking." Carl felt his blood run cold. A bioweapon. A deadly virus meant to wipe out entire species and leave only the Katarians standing. It was genocide on an unimaginable scale. Mind racing, Carl slipped out of the lab unnoticed. Over the next few days he threw himself into his own secret investigation. He used his skills in xenobiology to analyze Xanth and the others' project files, looking for any clues about the virus they were developing. He hacked into the Academy's security systems, tracking his classmates' movements and communications. And the deeper he dug, the more disturbed he became. The conspiracy seemed to extend far beyond a few radical students. Encrypted messages hinted at support from high-ranking Katarian officials, at a carefully orchestrated plan years in the making. This was bigger than Carl could have imagined, and he was the only one who knew the terrible truth. The weight of that knowledge settled over him like a suffocating blanket, even as he worked frantically to gather the proof he needed. Because if he failed, if Xanth succeeded in unleashing his doomsday virus, it wouldn't just be the end of the Galactic Unity Festival. Carl's fingers flew across the keyboard as he delved deeper into the Academy's secure database, his heart pounding in his chest. The lines of code blurred together as he searched for any shred of evidence that could expose the sinister plot he had stumbled upon. But as he finally broke through the last firewall and accessed the encrypted files, Carl's blood ran cold. The truth was far more terrifying than he could have imagined. The virus wasn't just the work of a few extremist students. It was the creation of a shadowy Katarian military organization known as the Shadow Claws, and they had infiltrated every level of the Galactic Academy. Carl's mind raced as he scanned the documents, piecing together the horrifying scope of their plan. Xanth, Zor, Kresh. They were merely pawns, expendable foot soldiers in a much larger scheme to destabilize the galactic community and pave the way for a Katarian empire. The Shadow Claws had been planning this for years, carefully planting their agents in key positions throughout the Academy, and now, with the virus nearly complete, they were poised to strike at the very heart of galactic unity. Carl's hands shook as he downloaded the files to a secure drive, his mind already racing with the implications. He had to get this information to the authorities, had to find a way to stop the Shadow Claws before it was too late. But just as he was about to log out of the system, a shadow fell across his screen. Carl spun around in his chair, his heart leaping into his throat as he found himself face to face with a hulking Katarian, his yellow eyes glinting with malice. Carl's mouth went dry as he recognized the Katarian's face from the files he had just been reading. Professor Xrath, one of the highest-ranking Shadowclaw agents within the Academy. Carl bolted from his chair, but Xrath was faster. The Katarian's razor-sharp claws slashed through the air, missing Carl's face by mere inches as he ducked and scrambled for the door. Carl ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he tore through the Academy's winding corridors. He could hear Xrath behind him, the Katarian's heavy footsteps echoing off the metal walls, his claws tearing through the paneling like paper. Left, right, left again. Carl's mind was a blur as he navigated the maze-like halls, desperately trying to put some distance between himself and his pursuer. But Zrath was relentless, always just a hair's breadth behind, his snarls of rage growing louder with each passing second. Carl's lungs burned, his muscles screamed in protest, but he pushed himself harder, faster. He couldn't let Zrath catch him, couldn't let the Shadow Claw's plan succeed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Carl burst through a set of double doors and found himself in the Academy's main atrium. He paused for a split second, gasping for breath, his eyes darting around the cavernous space for any sign of help. But the atrium was deserted, the only sound the distant hum of the ventilation system, and then from behind him came the ominous click of Zrath's claws against the polished floor. Carl spun around, his heart in his throat, as the Tarian emerged from the shadows. Zrath's eyes gleamed with predatory hunger, his lips curled back in a vicious snarl. "End of the line, little mouse," Zrath hissed, his claws flexing at his sides. "You've seen too much, and now you're going to die." Carl backed away, his mind racing, his options dwindling with each step. He was outmatched, overpowered. He couldn't hope to take on a trained Shadow Claw agent alone. "Carl?" a voice shouted from across the atrium. Carl's head snapped around, his eyes widening as he saw Jack sprinting towards him, his face etched with determination. Zrath whirled to face the new threat, his claws raised to strike. But Jack was already moving, his body a blur of motion as he closed the distance between them. The two collided in a flurry of slashing claws and pummeling fists, their battle cries echoing through the atrium. Carl watched in stunned disbelief as Jack held his own against the Tarian, matching Zrath's savagery with sheer human tenacity. But even as Jack fought, Carl knew it wouldn't be enough. Zrath was too strong, too fast. They needed a plan, a way to expose the Shadow Claws and stop the virus before it was too late. And then, as if in answer to his desperate thoughts, a figure emerged from the shadows at the far end of the atrium. A woman, human, her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, her eyes sharp and assessing. She strode towards them, her movements fluid and purposeful, and as she drew closer, Carl caught a glimpse of the insignia on her collar. A stylized eagle, its wings spread wide. "Earth's Galactic Intelligence Agency." "Carl Henry, Jack Morrison," the woman said, her voice calm and authoritative. "My name is Arya, and we need to talk." Carl and Jack exchanged a glance, their expressions a mix of confusion and wary hope. But before either of them could respond, Arya held up a hand, her eyes narrowing. And with that she turned on her heel and strode back the way she had come, leaving Carl and Jack no choice but to follow. As they hurried after Arya, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls, Carl's mind raced with questions. Who was this woman? What did she know about the Shadow Claws? And why had she sought them out? But even as the uncertainty gnawed at him, Carl felt a flicker of something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Because if Earth's intelligence agency was involved, if they had a chance to stop the Shadow Claws and prevent galactic catastrophe, then maybe, just maybe, they stood a chance after all. But as they followed Arya deeper into the bowels of the Academy, Carl couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far more dangerous than they could possibly imagine. And he was right. Because as Arya led them into a dimly lit room, her face grim and her eyes shadowed, Carl and Jack found themselves face to face with a truth that would shatter everything they thought they knew. "The Shadow Claws are just the beginning," Arya said, her voice low and urgent. "They're part of something much bigger, much more insidious, a rogue human faction known as the Omega Collective." Carl felt his blood run cold, his mind reeling with the implications. A human faction working against Earth? It was unthinkable. "They seek to overthrow the Earth government," Arya continued, her eyes boring into theirs, "to establish human dominance in the galaxy, no matter the cost, and they'll stop at nothing to achieve their goals." Arya's lips tightened, her gaze haunted. "Power," she said simply. "Greed. A twisted belief in human supremacy. The reasons are many, but the result is the same. Chaos, destruction, the end of everything we hold dear. Carl swallowed hard, his mind racing with the implications. The Shadow Claws, the virus, Xanth and his cronies. It was all connected, all part of a web of conspiracy and betrayal that threatened to unravel the very fabric of galactic society. And he and Jack were now at the center of it all, the only ones who knew the truth, the only ones who could stop it. But as Carl met Arya's gaze, he saw the uncertainty in her eyes, the fear that lurked beneath her steely exterior. And he knew, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that they were in over their heads. Because if the Omega Collective was as powerful and ruthless as Arya claimed, if they had infiltrated the highest levels of human society, then who could they trust? Who could they turn to for help? The answer, Carl realized with a shiver of dread, was no one. They were on their own, two humans and a mysterious agent, against a galaxy-spanning conspiracy that threatened to destroy everything they held dear. And as they huddled together in that dimly lit room, their faces etched with grim determination, Carl couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of an abyss, staring into the face of an enemy they could barely comprehend. But they had no choice. They had to fight, had to find a way to stop the Shadow Claws and the Omega Collective before it was too late. Even if it meant sacrificing everything they had ever known. The decision was made. Carl, Jack and Arya would infiltrate the secret Shadow Claw base hidden deep beneath the Academy, a desperate gambit to uncover the truth and stop the impending viral apocalypse. They armed themselves with what little weapons they could scrounge. A few plasma pistols, some smoke grenades, and a handful of EMP devices that Carl had hastily cobbled together using his knowledge of Tarian physiology. With grim faces, they descended into the bowels of the Academy, following Arya's lead through a maze of dimly lit corridors that seemed to twist and turn in on themselves. The air grew colder and staler the deeper they went, and an oppressive sense of dread settled over the group like a shroud. Suddenly, a haunting screech echoed through the halls, and the trio froze in their tracks. From the shadows emerged a grotesque figure, a Qatarian super-soldier engineered to be the ultimate killing machine. Its elongated limbs twitched with unnatural speed, and razor-sharp claws glinted in the dim light. The creature's eyes, a soulless black, locked onto the humans with predatory intensity. Jack reacted first, raising his plasma pistol and firing off a volley of shots. But the creature moved with blinding speed, dodging the blasts with ease and closing the distance between them in a heartbeat. Its claws slashed through the air, missing Jack's face by mere inches. Carl fumbled with one of his EMP devices, his fingers shaking as he armed it. He had identified a potential weakness in the Qatarian genetic coding, a vulnerability to electromagnetic pulses that could temporarily disable their enhanced systems. But he had to get close, dangerously close, to use it. As Jack grappled with the creature, his muscles straining against its inhuman strength, Carl darted forward. He ducked under a sweeping claw, rolled to the side, and came up behind the soldier. With a desperate cry, he jammed the EMP device against the base of the creature's skull and activated it. The Qatarian convulsed as the electromagnetic pulse surged through its body, its limbs spasming uncontrollably. Jack seized the opportunity, driving his fist into the creature's jaw with a sickening crunch. The soldier crumpled to the ground, its black eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. But there was no time to catch their breath. More screeches echoed through the halls, drawing closer with each passing second. Arya motioned for them to keep moving, her face a mask of grim determination. They fought their way deeper into the facility, Jack's combat skills and Arya's advanced technology working in tandem with Carl's improvised weapons. The Qatarian soldiers kept coming, wave after relentless wave, but the humans held their ground, driven by a desperate need to see their mission through. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of blood and sweat and terror, they reached the central laboratory. The room was a nightmarish fusion of science and horror, filled with bubbling tanks and flickering computer screens, and there, suspended in a stasis pod at the far end of the room, was a face that Carl recognized with a jolt of shock. Ellie? His younger sister, who had disappeared years ago during a colonial mission. Her face was pale and still, her body held in a sickening state of suspended animation, and with a growing sense of horror, Carl realized the truth. She was being used as a living incubator for the virus, her DNA the key to creating a strain that would specifically target Earth's population. Carl felt a wave of nausea wash over him, followed by a surge of blinding rage. The Shadowclaws had taken his sister, had twisted her into a tool for their genocidal plans. And now he was faced with an impossible choice. Save Ellie, or stop the virus. His sister, or the fate of billions. As alarms began to blare and the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, Carl knew that time was running out. He had to make a decision, had to confront the depths of his own humanity and the lengths he was willing to go to protect those he loved. But even as his mind raced and his heart pounded in his chest, Carl knew one thing for certain. Whatever choice he made, whatever the cost, he would not let the Shadowclaws win. He would not let their twisted vision of the future come to pass. Not while he still drew breath. Carl's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at Ellie's unconscious form, suspended in the stasis pod, like a macabre work of art. The sight of her pale, lifeless face, so familiar and yet so alien in this twisted context, threatened to shatter his resolve. But he couldn't falter now, not when his sister's life hung in the balance. With trembling fingers, Carl began to work on the pod's control panel, his mind racing as he tried to recall every scrap of information he had gleaned about Qatarian technology. Behind him, the sounds of Jack and Arya's weapons fire echoed through the laboratory, a grim reminder of the danger that lurked just beyond the door. Just as the pod seal hissed open, the door to the laboratory burst inward, revealing the hulking form of Xanth, flanked by a squad of heavily armed Shadowclaw soldiers. The Qatarian's eyes gleamed with malevolent triumph as he surveyed the scene before him. Carl froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the plasma pistol at his side. But Xanth was faster, his own weapon trained on Ellie's unconscious form. "Ah, ah, ah!" the Qatarian tutted, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Let's not do anything hasty now. We wouldn't want anything to happen to dear little sister, would we?" "What do you want, Xanth?" Carl asked, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. The Tarian's lips curled into a cruel smile. "What do I want? Why, I want you, Carl. Your brilliant mind, your knowledge of human biology. With you at our side, the Shadowclaws will be unstoppable. We will perfect the virus, and the galaxy will tremble before us." Carl's stomach churned at the thought, revulsion mingling with a sickening sense of despair. To join the Shadowclaws, to become a part of their twisted scheme, it was unthinkable. And yet, what choice did he have? If he refused, Xanth would kill Ellie, Jack, and Arya without a second thought. But as he stood there, trapped between the devil and the deep blue sea, something inside Carl snapped. A fierce, primal rage, born of desperation and the unbreakable bond of family, surged through his veins like molten fire. With a wordless cry of defiance, Carl lunged at Xanth, catching the Qatarian off guard. The two tumbled to the ground in a tangle of limbs, grappling for control of Xanth's weapon. Around them, the laboratory erupted into chaos as Jack and Arya sprang into action, their weapons blazing as they fought to keep the Shadowclaw soldiers at bay. In the midst of the firefight, Carl managed to wrench the plasma pistol from Xanth's grasp. But the Qatarian was far from defeated, his claws raking across Carl's face in a blinding flare of pain. Carl reeled back, his vision swimming, but he refused to let go of the weapon. With a last desperate surge of strength, Carl brought the butt of the pistol down on Xanth's temple, stunning the Qatarian long enough for him to scramble to his feet. But as he turned to face the Shadowclaw soldiers, his heart seized in his chest. Ellie, still trapped in the stasis pod, lay directly in the line of fire, and in that moment Carl knew what he had to do. With a speed born of desperation, he lunged for the pod, placing himself between Ellie and the hail of plasma bolts. He felt the searing heat of the weapon's fire as it tore through his flesh, but he didn't falter. With one hand, he wrenched open the pod's door, while with the other he fumbled for the vial of the virus he had pocketed during his investigation. As Xanth staggered to his feet, his eyes widening in horrified realization, Carl plunged the needle into the Tarian's neck, injecting him with a full dose of the deadly pathogen. Xanth screamed, his body convulsing as the virus ravaged his system from within. In the chaos that followed, Carl barely registered Jack and Arya's shouts of warning, barely felt their hands on his shoulders as they dragged him and Ellie away from the carnage. All he could focus on was the weight of his sister in his arms, the faint pulse of her heartbeat against his chest. They ran, stumbling through the twisting corridors of the Shadowclaw base as alarms blared and the facility shook with the force of secondary explosions. Somewhere behind them, Xanth's dying screams echoed through the halls, a chilling reminder of the horrors they had witnessed. And then they were outside, the cool night air rushing into their lungs as they emerged from the smoking ruins of the academy. But even as they gulped down lungfuls of clean, untainted oxygen, they knew that their ordeal was far from over. For there, waiting for them like avenging angels, was a contingent of galactic peacekeepers, their weapons trained on the battered and bloodied humans. At their head stood a grizzled, battle-scarred man, his eyes hard and unforgiving as he surveyed the scene before him. Carl's heart sank, even as a small part of him rejoiced at the knowledge that Arya's encrypted transmissions had not gone unheeded. But as he looked at the faces of his companions, saw the weariness and the fear etched into their features, he knew that their fight was far from over. For even as the peacekeepers led them away, even as the promise of justice and retribution hung heavy in the air, Carl couldn't shake the feeling that the true mastermind behind the Shadowclaws was still out there, waiting in the shadows. And that thought, more than anything, filled him with a dread that chilled him to his very core. Carl sat in the dimly lit debriefing room, his mind still reeling from the events that had transpired at the Galactic Academy. Beside him, Jack, Arya, and Ellie wore expressions of exhaustion and uncertainty, the weight of their ordeal etched into their features. Colonel Thorne, his face a mask of grim determination, leaned forward in his chair. "We've been tracking the Shadowclaws and the Omega Collective for months," he began, his voice low and urgent. "But they've always managed to stay one step ahead of us, until now." He fixed each of them with a piercing stare. "You four have seen the horrors they're capable of firsthand. You've fought against them and survived. That's why I'm asking you to join Operation Deathworld, a special task force designed to take them down from the inside." Carl exchanged glances with the others, a mixture of apprehension and determination in their eyes. They had all witnessed the atrocities committed by the Shadowclaws, had all lost something in the fight against them. But the thought of diving back into that world, of facing those horrors once again, was almost too much to bear. And yet, as Carl looked at Ellie, saw the haunted look in her eyes, he knew that he couldn't turn away. Not now, not when they had a chance to put an end to this nightmare once and for all. "I'm in," he said, his voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at his insides. "Whatever it takes, I'll do it." One by one, the others nodded their agreement, their faces set with grim resolve. They knew the risks, knew the price they might have to pay. But they also knew that they were the only ones who could see this through to the end. In the weeks that followed, Carl and the others underwent a grueling training regimen, pushing their bodies and minds to the limit as they prepared for the mission ahead. They learned new combat techniques, studied the intricacies of Qatarian biology and technology, and honed their skills in infiltration and espionage. But as the days turned into weeks, Carl began to notice strange changes in himself. His senses seemed sharper, his reflexes faster. He could hear the whisper of footsteps from across the room, could smell the faintest traces of chemicals in the air. At first he tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the stress of his training. But as the changes became more pronounced, he knew that something was different, something that couldn't be explained away so easily. It was during a sparring session with Jack that the truth finally came to light. As they traded blows, Carl felt a surge of strength course through his veins, a raw, primal power that he had never experienced before. With a single, lightning-fast strike, he sent Jack flying across the room, his body slamming into the wall with a sickening crunch. Carl stared at his hands, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. What was happening to him? What had the virus done to his body? As he helped Jack to his feet, apologizing profusely, Colonel Thorne entered the room, his face a mask of concern. "We need to talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. In the privacy of Thorne's office, Carl learned the truth about his condition. The virus he had been exposed to in the Shadow Claw base had triggered a latent genetic mutation, one that had lain dormant in human DNA for centuries. Known as the Deathworld gene, this mutation was a remnant of humanity's evolution on Earth, a planet notorious for its harsh environment and deadly predators. It granted those who possessed it enhanced strength, speed, and senses, as well as an accelerated healing factor. Carl's mind reeled with the implications. If he possessed this gene, then so did the other humans on the task force. And if the Shadow Claws and the Omega Collective ever discovered its existence... As word of Carl's mutation spread among the task force, he began to notice similar changes in the other human members. They moved with a newfound grace and agility, their senses sharpened to an almost superhuman degree. Colonel Thorne, his eyes alight with a newfound hope, began to suspect that the Deathworld gene might be the key to unraveling the conspiracy, to stopping the Shadow Claws and the Omega Collective once and for all. But even as they threw themselves into their preparations with renewed vigor, Carl couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that some unseen force was pulling the strings from the shadows. Little did he know just how right he was. In a secret location deep within Tarian space, a shadowy figure known only as the Overseer watched the events unfolding on a series of holographic monitors, his eyes glinting with malevolent anticipation. For centuries he had been plotting and scheming, carefully positioning his pieces on the galactic chessboard. And now, with the discovery of the Deathworld gene, the final phase of his plan could begin. He leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a cruel smile. The humans thought they had a chance, thought they could stop what was coming. But they had no idea of the true scope of his machinations, of the horrors that awaited them in the depths of space. And as the Overseer began to put his final plans in motion, he knew that the fate of the galaxy itself hung in the balance. The Deathworld conspiracy was about to reach its terrifying climax, and the humans were walking straight into the heart of the storm. Carl's heart pounded in his chest as the dropship descended through the turbulent atmosphere of Nexus 7. The planet's surface, a bleak expanse of jagged rock formations and swirling dust storms, loomed ominously below. Beside him, Jack, Arya, and Ellie checked their weapons and equipment, their faces etched with grim determination. As the ship touched down on a windswept plateau, the team disembarked, their boots crunching on the rocky ground. Carl scanned the horizon, his enhanced senses picking up the faintest traces of movement in the distance. "The facility should be just over that ridge," Arya said, consulting a holographic map projected from her wrist-mounted computer. "But be on your guard. If the Omega Collective is here, they won't give up their secrets without a fight." The team set out across the treacherous terrain, picking their way through fields of razor-sharp obsidian and skirting around bubbling pools of noxious chemicals. As they crested the ridge, they spotted their target, a sprawling complex of prefabricated buildings and towering generators, nestled in a crater that looked suspiciously like an impact site. As they approached the perimeter, Carl's heightened hearing picked up the hum of machinery and the distant echoes of human voices. He signaled for the team to take cover behind a cluster of boulders, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. Suddenly a series of explosions rocked the ground, sending geysers of rock and dust into the air. From the smoke and chaos emerged a group of figures, their bodies encased in sleek black armor that seemed to ripple and shift in the dim light. "Deathworld hybrids," Arya hissed, her voice tight with fear. "They're faster and stronger than any human or Tarian. We need to be careful." The hybrids charged forward, their movements a blur of speed and precision. Carl and his team opened fire, their weapons spitting streams of plasma and laser fire, but the hybrids seemed to shrug off the attacks like they were nothing. Carl found himself face to face with a hybrid, its eyes glowing an eerie red behind its visor. He dodged a lightning-fast strike, rolling to the side and coming up firing, but the hybrid was too quick, closing the distance between them in the blink of an eye. As they grappled, Carl couldn't shake the feeling that there was something familiar about the hybrid's movements, the way it anticipated his every attack. And then, as he stared into those glowing red eyes, he saw a flicker of recognition, a hint of the man he had once called father. Before he could respond, alarms began to blare throughout the facility, the sound of metal on metal echoing through the corridors. The overseer's voice, cold and cruel, crackled over the intercom. Carl's team, battered and bleeding but still standing, regrouped in the center of the compound. They had fought their way through waves of hybrids and Shadowclaw soldiers, the ground littered with the bodies of friend and foe alike. "We have to get out of here," Arya panted, her face streaked with sweat and grime. "The whole place is going to blow." But Carl hesitated, his gaze locked on Zeta's retreating form. He couldn't leave his father, not like this, not when there was still a chance to save him. Carl opened his mouth to protest, but Jack grabbed his arm, his grip firm. "We have to go, Carl. We can't save everyone." With a final anguished look at his father, Carl turned and ran, his team close behind. They raced through the crumbling corridors, dodging falling debris and bursts of flame, the countdown to detonation echoing in their ears. As they reached the dropship, Carl risked one last glance back at the facility, just in time to see it erupt in a blinding flash of light. The shock wave slammed into the ship, sending it tumbling end over end through the turbulent sky. But somehow, miraculously, they made it out alive, the dropship limping its way back to the rendezvous point on sheer force of will. As they docked with the waiting carrier, Carl stumbled from the ship, his mind numb with grief and shock. Colonel Thorne was waiting for them, his face grave. "What happened down there?" he demanded, his voice tight with concern. But Carl could barely speak, his thoughts consumed by the image of his father's face, twisted by the Omega Collective's cruel experiments. He had thought that by joining Operation Deathworld, he could put an end to the conspiracy, could bring the Overseer to justice. But now as he looked out at the stars, he realized that the true scope of the Deathworld conspiracy was far beyond anything he could have imagined, and that the Overseer's plans, whatever they might be, were only just beginning to unfold. In the aftermath of the harrowing mission on Nexus 7, Carl and his team found themselves back at Galactic Peacekeeper headquarters, their minds still reeling from the revelations about Carl's father and the true depth of the Omega Collective's machinations. As they stepped into the debriefing room, the weight of their experiences hung heavy in the air. Colonel Thorne stood at the head of the table, his weathered face etched with concern. Around him sat a council of representatives from various alien species, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright suspicion. Carl took his seat, Jack and Ellie flanking him on either side, while Arya positioned herself at the far end of the table, her gaze inscrutable. As the debriefing began, Colonel Thorne laid out the facts of the mission, his voice steady and measured, but as he delved into the details of the Omega Collective's experiments and the existence of the Deathworld hybrids, a palpable tension began to build in the room. And then came the bombshell. Based on the information gathered by Carl and his team, we have reason to believe that the Overseer is not Katarian, as we initially suspected, Colonel Thorne said, his words cutting through the silence like a knife. In fact, evidence suggests that the Overseer is human. The room erupted into chaos, with council members shouting over each other in a cacophony of accusation and disbelief. Some pointed fingers at Carl and his team, while others cast suspicion on the entire human race. "This is outrageous," a Tarian representative snarled, slamming his fist on the table. "The humans have been manipulating us from the start, using this conspiracy to seize power for themselves." Carl leapt to his feet, his voice rising above the din. "That's not true. We're just as much victims in this as anyone else. We've been fighting to stop the Overseer, not help them." But even as he spoke, he couldn't shake the nagging doubt that gnawed at the back of his mind. If the Overseer was human, did that mean that humanity itself was somehow complicit in this galactic nightmare? As the debriefing devolved into arguments and recriminations, Carl caught a glimpse of Arya out of the corner of his eye. She sat perfectly still, her face an unreadable mask, but something about her demeanor sent a chill down his spine. And then, without warning, the lights in the room flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. Screams echoed through the chamber as a series of explosions rocked the building, the sound of shattering glass and twisting metal filling the air. Carl and his team sprang into action, their enhanced senses guiding them through the smoky chaos. They fought their way through the debris, their hearts pounding in their chests as they searched for survivors. But as they emerged into the hallway, they found themselves face to face with a scene of unimaginable horror. Bodies lay strewn across the floor, the walls splattered with blood and viscera, and there, standing amid the carnage, was a figure clad in black, a mask obscuring their features. The figure turned to face them, their voice distorted and inhuman. "The Overseer sends their regards." And then, with a flash of blinding light, the figure vanished, leaving Carl and his team alone in the devastation. As they picked their way through the ruins of the Galactic Peacekeeper headquarters, the full weight of their failure began to sink in. They had been tasked with protecting the Council, with uncovering the identity of the Overseer and stopping their nefarious plans. But instead, they had played right into the Overseer's hands, allowing them to strike at the very heart of galactic order. As emergency crews rushed to the scene and the wounded were carried away on stretchers, Carl and Colonel Thorne huddled together in a makeshift command center, their faces grim. "This is just the beginning," Colonel Thorne said, his voice heavy with resignation. "The Overseer has made their move, and they won't stop until they have complete control." But even as he spoke the words, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late, that the Overseer had been planning this for longer than any of them could have imagined, and that the fate of the galaxy now hung in the balance, with only a handful of humans and their allies standing between it and total annihilation. Over the next few days, a grim pattern began to emerge. Key members of the Council and the Peacekeeper leadership were targeted in a series of increasingly brazen attacks, each one leaving a trail of bodies and unanswered questions in its wake. Carl and his team worked around the clock, poring over security footage and interviewing witnesses, desperately trying to piece together the clues that would lead them to the Overseer. But every lead seemed to dead end. Every trail went cold, just as they thought they were getting close. It was Ellie who finally found the break they needed. She had been sifting through a mountain of data, cross-referencing it with the information they had gathered on Nexus 7, when she stumbled upon a pattern that made her blood run cold. "Look at this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper as she pulled up a series of images on the screen. "Every attack, every assassination, they all have one thing in common. The victims had all visited the same set of coordinates in the days leading up to their deaths." Carl leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he studied the star map. "Where is that? Some kind of remote outpost?" Ellie shook her head, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she pulled up more information. "No, it's a space station, privately owned and operated, with no official affiliation to any government or organization. And look who owns it." The image that filled the screen was grainy and distorted, but there was no mistaking the figure at its center. A human, clad in a dark suit, their face obscured by shadows. "The Overseer," Carl breathed, his heart pounding in his chest. "It has to be." Colonel Thorne nodded grimly. "Then that's where we need to go. We'll infiltrate the station, gather whatever evidence we can, and take down the Overseer once and for all." But even as they laid their plans, Carl couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap, that the Overseer was always one step ahead, always watching from the shadows. As they boarded their ship and set course for the space station, he couldn't help but wonder if they were ready for the horrors that awaited them there, if any of them would make it out alive. But he pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the mission at hand. They had a job to do, and the fate of the galaxy depended on their success, no matter the cost. The space station loomed before them like a behemoth, its sleek black hull seeming to absorb the very light around it. As their ship docked and they made their way inside, Carl and his team were struck by the eerie silence that permeated the halls. There were no signs of life, no indications that anyone had been there in a very long time, but as they delved deeper into the station's bowels, they began to pick up on a faint energy signature, a pulsing rhythm that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. They followed the signal, their weapons at the ready, until they found themselves standing before a massive set of blast doors. And there, waiting for them, was a figure they had never expected to see. "Aria," Carl gasped, his eyes widening in shock. "What are you doing here?" But as she stepped out of the shadows, her face twisted into a cruel smile, they realized the truth. Aria was the overseer, the mastermind behind the entire conspiracy. "I must admit I'm impressed," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I didn't think you'd make it this far." Carl's mind reeled as he tried to process the revelation. Aria, the woman who had fought alongside them, who had risked her life to help them. She had been manipulating them from the start. "But why?" he managed to choke out, his voice raw with betrayal. "Why go to all this trouble? What do you want?" She began to pace, her movements fluid and predatory. "You see, I'm not just a Deathworld hybrid. I'm the first, the prototype. The Omega Collective created me to be the perfect weapon, a tool to shape the galaxy in their image." Carl's blood ran cold as he realized the implications of her words. Aria had been using them all along, playing both sides against each other in a twisted game of chess. "But the Collective underestimated me," she continued, her voice rising in pitch. "They thought they could control me, but they were wrong. And now, with an army of Deathworld hybrids at my command, I will bring the galaxy to its knees." As if on cue, the blast doors behind her slid open, revealing a horde of twisted, misshapen creatures. They were Deathworld hybrids, their bodies warped and distorted by the same genetic enhancements that flowed through Carl's veins. And at their head stood Zeta, his eyes glowing with an inhuman light. "You see?" Aria crowed, her arms spread wide. "I have been planning this for years, laying the groundwork for my ascension. And now, with the galactic peacekeepers in disarray and the Council on the brink of collapse, there is no one left to stop me." But even as she spoke, Carl felt a surge of determination rising within him. He glanced at his team, saw the same fire burning in their eyes, and knew that they would not go down without a fight. "You're wrong, Aria," he said, his voice steady and clear. "We will stop you. We will fight until our last breath to protect the people of this galaxy, to ensure that your twisted vision never comes to pass." And with that they charged forward, their weapons blazing, their hearts pounding with the knowledge that the fate of the galaxy rested on their shoulders. The battle was fierce and bloody, a whirlwind of clashing bodies and searing energy beams. Carl and his team fought with everything they had, their enhanced abilities pushed to the limit as they faced off against Aria's army of Deathworld hybrids. But even as they cut through the horde, Carl knew that the true fight lay ahead. Aria was a formidable opponent, her own abilities far beyond anything they had ever faced before. And so, as the last of the hybrids fell, Carl turned to face her, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment of truth. They circled each other warily, their movements a blur of speed and precision. Aria lashed out with a flurry of blows, her fists and feet moving with inhuman grace. But Carl was ready for her, his own body responding with a swiftness and agility that surprised even him. They traded blows back and forth, neither one giving an inch. The air crackled with the energy of their colliding powers, the very fabric of reality seeming to warp and twist around them. But even as they fought, Carl could feel his strength beginning to wane. Aria was relentless, her stamina seemingly endless, and with each passing moment he could feel his own reserves starting to run dry. And then, just as he thought all hope was lost, he heard a voice calling out from behind him. "Carl!" It was Colonel Thorne, his face battered and bloody, but his eyes alight with fierce determination. "Catch!" He tossed something through the air, a glinting metallic object that spun end over end as it arced towards Carl. And in that moment, Carl knew what he had to do. He reached out, his fingers closing around the object just as Arya lunged forward, her hand outstretched to snatch it away. But he was faster, his arm swinging around in a wide arc to bring the object down on her head with a sickening crunch. Arya stumbled back, her eyes wide with shock and pain. And in that moment of vulnerability, Carl pressed his advantage. He unleashed a flurry of blows, his fists and feet moving with a speed and precision that he had never known before. And then, with one final devastating strike, Arya crumpled to the ground, her body broken and still. And he knew that even though they had won this battle, the war was far from over. The Overseer may have been defeated, but the Omega Collective was still out there, waiting in the shadows. And as he gathered his team and prepared to make their way back to the Galactic Peacekeeper headquarters, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. That the true fight for the fate of the galaxy was just getting started. As the dust settled in the ruins of the Galactic Peacekeeper headquarters, Carl and his team emerged from the rubble, battered and bruised but alive. The galaxy had been saved, but at a terrible cost. The death toll was staggering, with countless lives lost in the battle against Arya and her army of mind-controlled aliens and Deathworld hybrids. Yet even in the midst of the destruction, there was hope. The galactic community, once fractured and divided, now stood united in the face of this shared tragedy. A new council was formed, with representatives from all major species, including humans, working together to rebuild and restore order. Carl and his team were hailed as heroes, their bravery and sacrifice recognized by all. But for Carl, the victory felt hollow. The weight of the lives lost hung heavy on his shoulders, and the knowledge that the true mastermind behind the Deathworld conspiracy was still out there gnawed at his mind. As the weeks turned into months, Carl threw himself into the rebuilding efforts, working tirelessly to help restore the shattered infrastructure of the galactic community. But even as he worked, he found himself plagued by vivid nightmares and hallucinations, all centered around a mysterious planet known only as Deathworld Prime. As the visions grew more intense, Carl became convinced that Deathworld Prime held the key to understanding the true origins of the Deathworld gene and the Omega Collective's experiments. He knew that he had to go there, to uncover the truth behind the conspiracy and put an end to the threat once and for all. But when he brought his concerns to his friends and allies, they were hesitant. The scars of the battle against Arya were still fresh, and the thought of embarking on another dangerous mission so soon was almost too much to bear. "Carl, are you sure about this?" Jack asked, his brow furrowed with concern. "We barely made it out of the last mission alive. Can we really afford to take another risk like this?" Ellie, too, was skeptical. "What if it's a trap?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. "What if the Overseer is just waiting for us to make a move?" But Carl was adamant. He knew in his heart that this was the right thing to do, that they couldn't afford to wait any longer. And so, despite the concerns of his friends and allies, he assembled a small team, including Jack, Ellie, and a few trusted peacekeepers, to embark on a secret mission to Deathworld Prime. As they approached the planet, they found it surrounded by a strange energy field that seemed to interfere with their ship's systems. The closer they got, the more the ship shuddered and shook, as if it were being buffeted by some unseen force. But Carl refused to turn back. He guided the ship through the turbulence, his eyes fixed on the view screen as the planet grew larger and larger, and then, with a final shudder, they broke through the energy field and emerged into the atmosphere of Deathworld Prime. What they saw took their breath away. The planet was a nightmarish landscape of twisted, mutated creatures and bizarre alien structures, just like in Carl's dreams. The sky was a sickly green, and the air was thick with a noxious, sulphurous stench. As they landed the ship and stepped out onto the planet's surface, They were immediately set upon by a horde of grotesque, misshapen creatures, their bodies a twisted amalgamation of flesh and machine. Carl and his team fought them off with pulse rifles and plasma grenades, the creatures' shrieks of pain and rage echoing across the barren landscape. But even as they fought, Carl couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that some unseen force was guiding their every move. And as they pushed deeper into the planet's interior, he began to see signs of an ancient civilization, long since wiped out by some catastrophic event. They discovered a series of underground chambers filled with advanced technology and strange glowing artifacts. The walls were covered in intricate carvings and hieroglyphs, depicting scenes of war and destruction, of a great cataclysm that had consumed the planet and its inhabitants. And then, in the heart of the labyrinth, they found it. A massive, pulsating biomechanical structure, its surface covered in writhing tendrils and pulsing veins. It seemed to be the source of the energy field surrounding the planet, the key to unlocking the secrets of the Deathworld gene. As Carl approached the structure, he felt a sudden rush of memories and visions flooding his mind. He saw the true history of the Deathworld gene, the terrible secret behind its creation. He saw the ancient civilization that had once thrived on this planet, and the great cataclysm that had wiped them out. And he saw the Omega Collective, their experiments merely the tip of the iceberg in a vast galaxy-spanning conspiracy. The Deathworld gene was more than just a tool for creating super soldiers. It was a weapon of unimaginable power, one that could potentially destroy the entire galaxy. Carl staggered back from the structure, his mind reeling from the revelation. He turned to his team, his mouth opening to share what he had learned. But before he could speak, a horde of monstrous creatures burst from the shadows, their twisted forms bristling with jagged claws and pulsing sickly green bioluminescence. Ellie and the peacekeepers fought bravely, but they too were quickly overwhelmed. Carl watched in horror as they were dragged down, their bodies disappearing beneath a writhing mass of claws and teeth. In a desperate last stand, Carl fought his way back to the ship, his pulse rifle blazing as he cut a path through the horde. But even as he reached the airlock, he knew that he couldn't leave, not without destroying the biomechanical structure and the terrible secret it contained. With a final anguished look at his fallen comrades, Carl turned back towards the heart of the labyrinth. He fought his way through the remaining creatures, his body pushed to the very limits of its enhanced abilities. And then, with a final, desperate burst of speed, he reached the structure. He placed a series of plasma charges around its base, his hands shaking with exhaustion and grief, and then, with a final defiant yell, he detonated them, setting off a chain reaction that tore through the structure and the surrounding chambers. As the planet began to shake and rumble beneath his feet, Carl raced back to the ship, his heart pounding in his chest. He barely made it inside before the shockwave hit, the force of the explosion sending the ship tumbling end over end through the atmosphere. But somehow, miraculously, he managed to regain control, guiding the ship back out into the cold emptiness of space. And as he watched Deathworld Prime disappear behind him, consumed by a massive, roiling cloud of fire and debris, he felt a sense of grim satisfaction wash over him. He had done it. He had uncovered the terrible truth behind the Deathworld conspiracy and destroyed the source of its power. But even as he set a course back to the galactic core, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Somewhere out there, the true mastermind behind the conspiracy was still waiting, plotting their next move. And Carl knew that he would have to be ready, that he would have to fight with every ounce of his strength and cunning to stop them. For the sake of the galaxy, and for the memory of his fallen friends, he would not rest until the threat was ended, once and for all. Carl's heart pounded as he stood before the Galactic Council, the weight of his discoveries on Deathworld Prime hanging heavy in the air. He took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over the assembled representatives from countless alien species, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. "The Deathworld gene," he began, his voice steady despite the turmoil raging inside him, "is more than just a biological quirk. It's a weapon, one of unimaginable power and destruction, and if it falls into the wrong hands, it could mean the end of everything we know." the chamber erupted into chaos, a cacophony of shouts and accusations from the council members. Some demanded that all humans be immediately quarantined, their voices shrill with fear and anger. Others called for the complete extermination of the human race, their eyes cold and merciless. Carl stood his ground, his fists clenched at his sides as he waited for the uproar to subside. When the chamber finally fell silent, he spoke again, his words measured and calm. "I understand your fears," he said, his gaze meeting those of the council members one by one. "But we cannot let fear drive us to rash actions. The Deathworld gene is a part of who we are, but it does not define us. We are more than our biology, more than the circumstances of our evolution." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "That is why I propose the creation of the Deathworld Defense Initiative, a cooperative effort between humans and all other species to study and contain the gene, while also promoting understanding and cooperation between our peoples." The council members murmured amongst themselves, some nodding in tentative agreement, others shaking their heads in skepticism. But before they could come to a decision, a deafening explosion rocked the chamber, sending chunks of debris raining down from the ceiling. Carl spun around, his eyes widening in horror, as he saw a massive fleet of Omega Collective ships descending from the sky, their weapons already firing on the council headquarters. He barked orders to his team, his mind racing as he tried to formulate a plan. But even as they fought their way through the crumbling corridors, desperately trying to evacuate the council members to safety, Carl couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The Omega Collective's attack was too precise, too well coordinated. It was almost as if they had known exactly when and where to strike. And then, through the smoke and the chaos, he saw her. Ellie, his sister, standing at the head of the Omega Collective forces, her eyes blazing with a mad, fevered light. In that moment, Carl felt his world shatter, the pieces of his reality falling away like shards of broken glass. "Ellie," he whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief, "what have you done?" She raised her hand, and Carl felt an invisible force slam into him, sending him flying backwards into the wall. He struggled to his feet, his mind reeling as he tried to make sense of what was happening. "The galactic community rejected us," Ellie snarled, her eyes flashing with a mad, fevered light. "They feared us, hated us, tried to destroy us. But now, with the power of the Deathworld gene at my command, I will make them pay. I will create a new order, one where humanity rules supreme." Carl shook his head, his heart breaking as he realized the depths of his sister's madness. "Ellie, please," he begged, his voice cracking with emotion. "It doesn't have to be this way. We can still find a peaceful solution, still build a future for all species." But Ellie was beyond reason, beyond hope. With a scream of rage, she launched herself at Carl, her enhanced strength and speed fueled by the twisted power of the Deathworld gene. Carl met her blow for blow, his own abilities pushed to their limits as they fought across the crumbling battlefield. Around them, the remnants of the Omega Collective and the Peacekeeper forces clashed in a brutal, bloody melee, the screams of the dying mingling with the roar of weapons fire. In the end, it was Carl who emerged victorious. His heart shattered into a million pieces as he watched the light fade from Ellie's eyes. With her death, the Omega Collective forces fell into disarray, and the Peacekeepers were able to push them back, securing a hard-won victory. But as Carl stood amidst the ruins of the battlefield, his sister's blood still staining his hands, he knew that the true cost of that victory would haunt him for the rest of his days. He had been forced to make an impossible choice, to sacrifice the one person he had sworn to protect in order to save the galaxy from destruction. And yet, even as he wept for all that had been lost, Carl knew that he could not rest, could not let his sister's sacrifice be in vain. He would carry on the fight against the Deathworld gene, would work tirelessly to ensure that its power was never again used for evil. For he was a hero of Deathworld, and the weight of that duty would be his to bear for all eternity. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.